So it may be that the AI and the algorithms and the patch testing help to provide a diagnosis, but maybe there's still counseling input that's provided by a physician, because it's one thing knowing you're allergic to something. The next thing is, well, what do I do about it?
I bet this has happened to you. You start using this new perfume or sunscreen, and maybe you bought a new ring or a necklace and you notice a red, itchy rash under that ring or elsewhere on your body. It's pretty common. Certain chemicals can irritate our skin, or perhaps we're allergic to a specific substance. But the tests used to discover what you're allergic to can be time-consuming. Research is finding new ways to quickly and accurately diagnose skin conditions without you having to leave your home. That is ahead on this episode of Tomorrow's Cure, a podcast from Mayo Clinic that brings the future of medicine to the present. I'm Kathy Worzer. Thanks for joining us. Our guests are trying to change how skin patch testing is being done. Let's welcome Dr. Allison Bruce. Dr. Bruce is the chair of dermatology and the co-director of the Cosmetic Center at Mayo Clinic. She's also a professor of dermatology at Mayo Clinic in Florida. Also joining us is Dr. Charles Bruce. He is a professor of medicine in the Division of Cardiovascular Diseases at Mayo Clinic College of Medicine. He's also the Chief Innovation Officer at Mayo Clinic in Florida. They've collaborated on many projects, including this one, and the same last name is a tip-off that they are indeed married. Doctors Bruce and Bruce, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Kathy.
Thank you for having us.
Many underlying health conditions can first appear as skin problems, including some heart problems. Is that right?
Absolutely. In fact, I was going to touch on that, is that there are many manifestations of heart disease that manifest as skin conditions. And so psoriasis actually has a significant impact on chronic inflammation, and chronic inflammation has an impact, obviously, on our cardiovascular health.
Dr. Allison, I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. We always used to think of psoriasis as just a skin problem because people can see these, thick red scaly plaques on the skin, and patients were very self-conscious about it. But Charles alludes to the fact that it actually is a multi-system inflammatory disease. So the inflammation is driven by the immune system, and it may present in the skin, but it can affect other organs as well. And so patients with psoriasis have a higher incidence of cardiovascular disease. And so it's actually become much more routine now that if we treat patients for psoriasis, we'll actually ask that they either see a cardiologist or their primary care provider to make sure that they don't have other cardiovascular manifestations like high blood pressure.
Interesting. Can you tell us more about how something as simple as a skin rash could affect the whole body through the immune system?
There are immune regulatory cells that circulate not only in the blood, but they actually sit in the skin. So when things come into contact with the skin, they can trigger that immune system, and that is part of what causes rashes. But we also know that there are many, many multi-system diseases that are driven by immune dysregulation. So, for example, something like lupus, which is a multi-system disease, will manifest as skin rashes, ulcers, photosensitivity, things like that. So we know that you can't just affect one part of the immune system without necessarily having impact elsewhere.
The skin can get irritated by any number of different things, soaps and detergents and jewelry containing nickel. But I'm wondering here, Dr. Allison, is every rash an allergic reaction? Can it be simply an irritant that goes away fairly quickly? How do you determine which is which?
Yeah, that's a great question and very important, because dermatitis, which is exactly what you're describing, that sort of red irritation and itching of the skin, can occur for many different reasons. But it is an extremely common condition. Everybody kind of understands the term dermatitis or eczema, or knows somebody who has suffered from that itchy, debilitating skin rash. And some of the cases, as you say, are simply an irritation, which could happen to anybody. An irritating product like an acid, if you put it on the skin, is going to pretty much irritate anybody. Whereas an allergic contact is actually driven by the immune system. So when patients have dermatitis, as you say, it may just be an irritant. It may also be occurring because they have a family history of eczema that runs in the genetics of that patient, and that's one of the reasons why they may have dermatitis. But with contact dermatitis, what is happening is that your skin is exposed to a relatively harmless substance. But for whatever reason, your immune system doesn't see that as a harmless substance, but rather sees it as harmful to the body, and therefore mounts an immune response, which then manifests as, redness, itching, and so on. What's interesting about contact dermatitis is that it actually requires previous exposure to that substance to develop an allergy. So, for example, one of the things people will say to me is, oh, I've used this product forever. I've always been using this particular soap or moisturizer. And so they can't understand that this would suddenly be the problem for them. They say, oh, I've always used this. Why would I suddenly now have a reaction? And that is the whole point with allergic contact, is you require what's called a sensitization. In other words, you expose your immune system and the skin to this product. And over time, you then develop an allergy to that.
So what has been developed is a new AI machine learning model that can automate contact dermatitis diagnoses based on photos. That's very simplistic, I know, Dr. Allison, but is that pretty much what we're talking about here?
Yes, that's more or less what we're talking about, and I'll let Charles elaborate.
We've approached it in three ways. Firstly, a novel image capture solution using a smartphone, so that the patient is able to take an image of the skin patch reaction sites, and then those get automatically uploaded to the cloud, where they ultimately are then evaluated by this algorithm that we've developed based on a database of skin patch testing, expertly graded. In fact, many thousands of expertly graded and annotated images. And then we've also developed a novel skin patch that can be recognized by the algorithm by means of what's fiducial markers. And that's just a fancy term for being able to tell the computer algorithm where it's looking, what is its orientation, and what reaction site corresponds with which allergen.
And what gave you the idea to develop this AI model?
Allison has this habit of having her medical journals lying around, and I was bored. I decided just to flip through the pages of this particular one, and could not believe when I saw that skin patch testing was done the way it was done. It seemed medieval. It did not seem like something that should be done nowadays. That there was just clearly an opportunity for improvement.
For Dave Weiss, using lotions and creams did little to alleviate his suffering with eczema, so his doctor recommended patch testing.
The eczema would really travel throughout my body. My scalp was on fire and itching like crazy, my arms, my legs, my hands. And every year at my annual physical, the physician would say, well, what do you want to talk about? And I'd keep showing him my hands and my arms and say, look, we got to solve this problem. And that's what he said. Look, we have this thing called patch testing. It's worth a shot, Dave, because you've tried simply everything else. And I said, yeah, let's give it a shot. It can't hurt, because anything that would help solve this problem, to me, is worth the investment of time.
Patch testing was the standard, and doctors would eventually determine the cause of Dave's intense itching using patch testing. But with 15,000 potential allergens out there, there's no way you could test for all of them. So how did doctors know what to test for?
Well, we generally test for the things that people are most exposed to, because you do require repeat exposure. So physicians over time have developed sort of the most common allergens that are out there, and we test to the most common ones. And depending on, if you have a specific occupation, we may test to more specific allergens. So if you were a florist, for example, we may test to some of the chemicals and fragrances and so on that are found in plants. If you were a healthcare worker, we may test you to gloves, for example, the rubbers and substances that gloves are made of. We would test you to some of the preservatives and things that we find in soaps. So really, a lot of the testing will be guided by both occupation as well as hobbies that the patients may have. Because you're correct, you can't test for everything. And people can develop allergies to pretty much anything, even natural products. And so that's why sometimes when products are identified as hypoallergenic or dermatology tested, doesn't mean that you can't still develop an allergy to that product.
Dave Weiss went to his dermatologist to start the patch testing procedure.
They basically said, look, here's how it's going to work. We're going to tape 500 plus dime-shaped, metal spheres to your back, and it's going to have all kinds of allergens on it, chemicals, preservatives. And they also knew that I like to bake. So apparently there's a lot of ingredients that could also affect eczema with bakers. I see it all the time. So they really asked me about my lifestyle, things I like to do, hobbies, those types of things, so they could kind of hone in on the different types of allergens, ingredients, preservatives that they could really take a look at. And it takes, I would say it probably took a couple hours to get all of those taped on your back. Now, the thing is, you can't shower for 5 days. So, and again, I live in Florida, so it's pretty hot and humid, but you make do, right? And to try to get any kind of answer, I was more than happy to to go that route.
Dr. Allison, how does this 5-day testing process work?
So what would happen on day one is patients would come in and they would have patches placed on their skin. Typically, we use the back as the testing site. We would put multiple patches onto their skin. We leave them on for 48 hours. So the patients would come back on the third day, which would typically be the Wednesday. We would then remove the patches. And the reason they've had to stay on that long is because that's how long it takes your immune system to elicit this response to the allergen. And then we bring them back again on Friday once the patches have been removed to see over the next 48 hours what has developed. Have they developed redness in that area? Have they developed blistering, scaling, etc., which then tells us they're allergic to that allergen.
Initially, it's not too bad, but after a couple of days, it almost feels like you're wearing a backpack the whole time. And then obviously trying to sleep, it's hard to lay on your back, so you have to kind of find different positions. But they leave them on for essentially 3 days. And then you go back and they take them off, and you'll see a number of these, where the spheres were, you'll see a number of indications where there's obviously you're having a reaction to it. But they said, Dave, that's not it. So you're going to have to come back. Now, again, you can't shower, but you have 2 more days. Come back on Friday. And those that are still reactive, those are the areas, those are the ingredients, those are the things that we know are probably having an effect on you. After the 5 days, there was 2 ingredients. They were both preservatives. And lo and behold, they're in everything that I'm using. So I literally changed all of my soaps, all of my shampoos, conditioners, hand creams, you name it. And within a fairly short period of time, I would say within a month, things were big difference. And now I have no issues whatsoever. There's no cracking in my hands. There's no itching. There's no burning. All of the symptoms that I had went away, and it was all based on these 2 allergens. So this really changed my life. So for me, it was worth that 5-day investment.
But a full week of wearing the patches and going back and forth to the dermatologist is still a big commitment of time and resources that not everyone has access to, especially in rural or underserved communities. So what inspired you both to look to AI for another way to do this?
Now with machine learning, artificial intelligence, camera technology, and my interest in remote monitoring, that there must be a better way of being able to democratize skin patch testing. Because of these barriers to skin patch testing, historically, people have not had access to skin patch testing. So in fact, the most common allergen panels may not really represent real world common allergens, because there are many in our communities who are never able or lucky enough to actually come to a tertiary institution and have skin patch testing. If you can imagine, you're a mother, you've got a kid that's affected by this disorder, but you've got to figure out how to get her off school, you've got to get off your work, and it requires a commitment for a week. It's clearly difficult to do. And then from the other perspective is dermatologists. There aren't enough dermatologists right now. And furthermore, they don't have the infrastructure or resources to devote to this kind of testing because it is so labor intensive. And so this really does represent an opportunity of democratizing skin patch testing and just broadening access.
The way that we are now approaching it is there a better way to do this rather than having patients come into the clinic on that 3rd day and the 5th day to take off the patches, to look at them, interpret them? Can we use photography and deep machine learning to then interpret those tests so that the patients don't have to come back in to have those patches removed and interpreted manually by either a nurse or a physician? And the idea is, can we do that through photography, and can we even do it remotely? Is there an opportunity, for example, that patients could place the patches themselves rather than having to come in to a dermatologist? So that's sort of broadly speaking what we've been looking as the opportunity for this. And I'll let Charles jump in and explain it in a little more detail.
So basically what we're offering, we're democratizing skin patch testing and being able to provide a novel smartphone approach to the screening for allergy reactions that cause contact dermatitis, and that we use a smart learning, machine learning based approach that facilitates the diagnosis, allows a healthcare provider to establish a diagnosis and then offer a treatment plan to patients, basically addressing them so that they don't need to, come to a medical institution, spend a week nearby, to have the testing interpreted in person. And so we've been able to develop this both internally here at Mayo Clinic and conducted clinical trials supported through an award from Mayo Clinic to provide promising technologies that need development.
What did you find with this study? Did the AI model correctly diagnose the skin patches on the same scale as, say, a human would?
Yeah, so what's interesting is we initially developed the AI model on a retrospective, in other words, going back 10 years of all the skin patch tests that had been done with all the expertly graded reactions, and then training that algorithm to figure out, is there a reaction or not in the future? And what was most interesting is in the first clinical trial that we conducted on patients coming to our clinic, is that the engagement, the interest in enrolling in the study, because one of the other challenges is that we had was that our historic database didn't reflect a real world phenomenon. Most of the subjects we evaluated were older and were white. And so we wanted to look at what's called Fitzpatrick skin types that covered the spectrum. And Alison may want to just quickly describe what a Fitzpatrick skin type is.
Sure, happy to do that. So Fitzpatrick is a system that is used to grade skin color, putting it in somewhat simplistic terms, and it grades from type 1 to type 6. So broadly speaking, type 1 would be an extremely fair skin, maybe somebody from Scottish descent that would burn very easily, would be unable to tan, kind of the redhead, very pale white skin. And on the other end of the spectrum, Type 6 would be a very dark African American or black skin type. And obviously then there's all the gradation of shades in between. But it's obviously different interpreting redness or inflammation on a dark skin like the Fitzpatrick type 6 versus the type 1. And so this is where we had to make sure that we had data from all skin types so that we could adequately train our algorithm to interpret the reactions on the varying skin types.
In this particular trial, we enrolled nearly 300 patients, 47% of whom had Fitzpatrick skin types of 4 through 6, so that very much darker skin type. And when we subjected our algorithm to these broad range of skin tones, it performed well, but not as well as on the initial data set. But nevertheless promising enough that we are now conducting a current trial where we're looking at what's called an adaptive clinical trial, where we've already enrolled over 100 patients, where it's been supervised, where we've applied the patches, and then the interpretations have been done with guidance with the smartphone, and then the interpretation, and then ultimately where the patients themselves will be putting the patches on themselves, taking the photographs, and having the algorithm then determine whether or not a reaction is present or not.
A lot of this is hinging on the use of AI algorithms, machine learning. And I'm wondering, can there be noise or artifacts in some of these images? Can AI algorithms be tricked by small issues in photo quality, image quality, color magnification, that kind of thing that might be a challenge in dermatology?
One of the specific things is, well, there's no substitute for touching and feeling the surface of a skin lesion. There's so much information from that tactile information. And so we've actually studied that. We've looked at the interpretation of a layperson, someone like yourself, interpreting a photograph and saying, is there a reaction or not? And then someone who's somewhat trained, like a nurse, and then someone who's highly specialized training, like the contact dermatitis specialist who we work with. And we find that, in fact, he is better looking at a photograph. It's about the same as the algorithm just interpreting the photograph itself. So it's not as good as actually touching and feeling and being in person, but nevertheless is as good as an expert interpreting the image. But you're also important. It's important to standardize that image capture so that the images are not blurred, that in fact the person is taking the photograph of the actual reaction sites and doing it in a way that may accommodate their lack of dexterity. And so our approach to the patches, instead of putting them on the back, for example, is we put them on the volar aspect of the forearm, so that it's more convenient for the person or a loved one to be able to take the image where the patch had been placed.
So your study did take into consideration the variable textures and colors of skin types. But would you say, Dr. Allison, that to this point there's been some skin color bias in some of the AI models?
Absolutely. There have been various sort of commercially available sets that have been developed, but the data that's been gathered to develop that panel is largely derived from data on the fairer skin types, Fitzpatrick type 1 through 3. And so there isn't a lot of data included on the darker skin types. So, for example, hair dyes were the second most common allergen found in Black patients in the Mayo series versus what's in the typical standard series commercially available. And a lot of that may be related to cultural preferences and norms for that particular population group. Most hair dyes will have a chemical called PPD, which is very common in hair dyes, and there's a high incidence of allergy to that. In the study that was looking at African American patients' hair dyes, so the PPD is a common allergen. And if you buy, as I did, a kit to wash away the grays and dye them brown, the package insert actually will have a little explanation of how patients can do a rudimentary patch testing. Now, they don't call it specifically patch testing, but they do tell you to use a little bit of the dye, put it on your skin, wait 48 hours, and then to see if you have a reaction to that. And presumably, if you do have a reaction, the advice then is that you probably shouldn't use that hair dye kit. But that's just an example. Nickel was typically regarded as one of the most common allergens. And again, that's driven by cultural practices. So if people are exposed to nickel, usually through body piercings, that's probably going to emerge as a more common allergen in whatever population group is using a lot of body piercing. So you can see how cultural, society, race-based groups may differ in their allergens that are going to be more prevalent in that group.
This is what's so exciting about the ability to actually bring skin patch testing to the community and to allow people who otherwise would not have access to skin patch testing actually be able to test for potential allergens. Much better reflecting their exposure, their genetics, their race, their age, because our immunity and our response to immune phenomena changes as we get older.
Could this, what we're talking about here, be used to increase screening, full body screening on individuals who maybe have never had a full body screen?
I definitely think that's the way of the future, is training images to interpret. And there are a lot of technologies coming on the market, both handheld photography as well as more comprehensive sort of full body scanners, where it uses the same principle of taking multiple photographs and over time using that to train the algorithms to interpret what they're seeing, to identify lesions, for example, that may be of concern.
You mentioned teledermatology, which is something that has been greater during the pandemic, right? Dr. Allison, were you seeing patients? Were they satisfied with teledermatology in terms of these remote monitoring situations?
You know, dermatologists have been doing this forever, and maybe 80% of the time we're able to make a diagnosis based on the picture that they sent over, and we can either tell them, oh, don't worry about it, it'll go away in a week, or we tell them, no, that looks like something more worrisome, I'd go in and see your pediatrician. So there have been many cases that we've done that informally, and I think teledermatology is just a more formalized way of evaluating rashes and making diagnoses and trying to provide some input, which many times can help as an initial screening and to determine whether the patient even needs to come in to see a dermatologist. But I think another way that it's been very helpful is in follow-up care of patients, because often once you've seen the initial rash and you've made a diagnosis and evaluated the patient and taken a history and so on, you'll then institute a plan of care. And it's not necessary for that patient to come back. It may be that you can see the patient in follow-up in the comfort of their own home, and you can ask them, well, how's the medication going? Is it getting better? Do we need to up the dose? Do we need to adjust any of the treatment plan? So it's been extremely helpful in terms of follow-up so that patients don't have to keep coming back to see us. To what Charles was talking about earlier about having access to care available for more patients. And you also have to imagine there's scenarios where it can be extremely hard to even get to see a dermatologist.
The most significant barrier right now to this opportunity to benefit people at scale is actually bringing this to as a commercial product. Because it's one thing doing this in a research setting, it's another actually with the engineering, the scaling, the marketing, and developing. So we're actively looking for anyone interested in actually turning this promising technology into a commercial tool that can really benefit people at scale.
So just to be clear, the study, the kit, the trials still need FDA approval. And that might take a while, correct?
Yes. So right now we're in the development phase. We're looking for funding to support the commercialization of this as a tool, and then ultimately the regulatory approval through the FDA.
Say, Dr. Allison, as a dermatologist, I'm wondering, what do you think patients might think when they learn that their malady, be it contact dermatitis or what have you, is diagnosed by AI?
You know, Kathy, I don't know that we're quite at the point yet where we've had enough patient input on that, but my sense is that patients would probably accept the technology quite well. So it may be that the AI and the algorithms and the patch testing models and so on help to provide a diagnosis, but maybe there's still counseling input that's provided by a physician, because it's one thing knowing you're allergic to something. The next thing is, well, what do I do about it? Particularly if it's an occupational exposure, how do I avoid it? What are the things I need to do to avoid it? Where will I find these substances? This is a tool, an additional tool. It's not necessarily going to take away from certain technologies that we have currently, but it may help to add to what we are able to do for our patients.
There's no reason that we shouldn't test the patient then for that specific allergen to confirm that, in fact, the screening test was correct. And then, obviously, with the expertise that Allison and the dermatology community provide, is understanding then why is that particular person allergic to that particular reaction.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And that's what we talk about in terms of relevance. So if you're allergic to something, which many people may be, but you're never exposed to it, it's not important. It's not relevant. So many of us are allergic to poison ivy, but if you're not out there in the woods and you're not exposed to poison ivy, for example, it's not relevant. And so everything has to be interpreted in the context of the patient, their lifestyle, their occupation, their hobbies, etc. And even with standard patch testing currently, we test to many different allergens. And sometimes we'll identify something to which the patient is allergic. But when we go through their history, it's completely irrelevant. So even though they're allergic to it, it still is not what's causing their rash. So everything has to be interpreted in the light of the clinical context.
Has the FDA ever approved an AI device for dermatology diagnosis or treatment?
I think that the FDA did recently approve an imaging device, but I think there is a long way to go in terms of validation and so on before the FDA approves a lot of these devices, because it obviously is the holy grail. But obviously the path to that is long and complex and a lot more nuanced than simply, is there some kind of scanner that will automatically tell you what's on your skin and whether it's a problem or not?
Well, I'm very optimistic that it will happen because, I have firsthand experience of, developing a Band-Aid style sensor that developed, and this is together with the team here at Mayo Clinic, to detect atrial fibrillation, this irregular heartbeat that can result in stroke. And I remember people having the same responses. How are you going to do this? The FDA will never approve anything like this. There's no business model for this. These technologies are now available and, in fact, are detecting heart rhythm disorders that are hopefully allowing early intervention and stroke prevention. So I'm convinced that the kinds of solutions that we're working on within the dermatology space will ultimately benefit people all over the world.
Oh, gosh, this is so interesting. Doctors Bruce and Bruce, really, it has been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy.
Thank you.
Mayo Clinic has a financial interest in the technology referenced in this podcast. Mayo Clinic will use any revenue it receives to support its not-for-profit mission in patient care, education, and research. Tomorrow's Cure is a co-production of Mayo Clinic and PRX. Our producers are Deborah Balthazar and David Newtown. The show is edited by Genevieve Sponsler. Our sound engineer is Tommy Bazarian. Our theme was composed and produced by Terrence Bernardo. Tony Carlson is our production manager, and our executive producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez. Special thanks to Preston Spire for audio-visual production support. Be sure to follow Tomorrow's Cure wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Kathy Wurzer. Thank you so much for listening.